Okay, so we are starting the third session of this conference on the use of artificial intelligence and the ethical questions in our IFCU New Frontier Forum 2020 about artificial intelligence and Catholic universities. Today we have two guest speakers. The first one is Professor Don Howard. Professor Howard is a professor of philosophy, co-director of the Center's Ethics of Emerging Technologies focus area at the University of Notre Dame, Reilly Center for Science, Technology and Values in the States. He is also the co-founder of the International Society for the History of Philosophy of Science and was the founding co-editor of its journal, Hopos, University of Chicago Press. So, Professor Howard, the floor is yours for a 15 minutes speech, and then Professor Thierry Magnin. I will present Professor Magnin later. Okay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. First of all, let me thank the organizers of this meeting for the invitation to be part of this event. Longstanding interests in the issues that we're talking about here. But it's a special pleasure for me to be able to talk about these topics with an uncommonly interdisciplinary group of thinkers. It's always good for me to get out of my philosophy sandbox, as we say, and interact with scholars who bring very different perspectives to these issues. I very much enjoyed the conversation yesterday, and I'm looking forward to the continuation of the conversation today. So our subject is AI and Catholic universities, and the specific topic of our session today is ethical issues. There are, of course, many urgent, important ethical problems posed by artificial intelligence and the development of related technologies. And many of these questions have already been broached yesterday in our discussion. Among them, the question of questions about privacy, questions about facial recognition, algorithmic bias, technological unemployment, the impact of AI and related technologies on global inequities in power and wealth and so forth. Instead of my just picking some random selection of these problems to talk about, I thought I would focus on two issues to get us started this morning. First, since this is about AI and Catholic universities, I thought that I would say a little bit about how my university, the University of, well, as we say here in the US heartland, not Notre Dame, but Notre Dame, about how my university has been responding to this challenge. And then secondly, I wanted to focus on a cluster of issues that are especially closely related to a topic that I care deeply about, and that is the implications of developments in artificial intelligence for our thinking about the problem of human personhood. But first, as I said, I wanted to say a little bit about what my university has been doing in recent years to respond to these challenges. It was mentioned in one of the sessions yesterday that one of the most important imperatives in the current situation is for all of us to do a better job of incorporating ethics education in the curricula of our universities. This is something that we care a lot about here at Notre Dame. So for example, over the past 10 years or so, we have been developing an ever-expanding array of courses that touch upon many issues in technology ethics. For example, we have a hugely popular undergraduate course on the ethics of emerging weapons technologies. We have developed a completely online course on robot ethics. We have developed another course that's hugely popular on the ethics of responsible technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. As we speak, we're developing a very interesting new course on data ethics. One of the things that we have found as we have built these courses, to our surprise and our delight, is that, at least at our university, there is a virtually inexhaustible audience among our students for courses in this area. I think that in this case, as in others, our students are more alert to the way the world is changing than perhaps some of us are, and recognize that exposure to problems of ethics, thinking about problems of the ethics of technology, is something that's going to be career enhancing for them in future. This is especially true when it comes to our students in engineering and in business who flock to these courses. Another thing that we have done that I'm very, very happy about is that last year we launched a very ambitious new Notre Dame Center for Technology Ethics with significant funding support in partnership with IBM. And we are going to be doing a lot of hiring in the area, adding perhaps 15 new faculty members spread among a number of departments: philosophy, sociology, engineering, law, and so forth. It's a very exciting new adventure for us, and I'm very happy to be a part of this new initiative. So institutionally, we have already committed a lot of resources to addressing the ethical challenges posed by AI and, again, related technologies. But as I said, I also wanted to focus on some ethical issues that touch upon the question dear to me of human personhood. I think that these are among the most important ethical challenges that we're going to be facing in the coming years in this entire domain. I want to speak about three problems concerning human personhood. The first is, of course, the one that is so prominent in public discourse about developments of AI, and that is the question of whether or not in the near or long-term future we will have to confront the possibility of what some people call artificial personhood. Now, let me be clear, for all that the developments in artificial intelligence have been really dramatic in the past 10 to 20 years, and will, of course, accelerate in the near term, we're still a long way away from the point where we realistically have to consider the question of artificial personhood. Nonetheless, even though that's far in the future, if we're ever going to reach that point, it's important that we be thinking about this question now, not because tomorrow we're going to have to ask whether or not we grant citizenship to an artificial entity, but because the mere possibility of artificial personhood, AI that is so advanced that it is capable of doing everything that we associate with the human person, even though that is far in the future, the mere possibility of that forces us now to think or rethink what we assume constitutes human personhood. In a moment, I'm going to say a little bit more about my own views on what is really essential to this concept. But again, I want to make the general point that this problem is going to force us to rethink what that concept of the human person is in profound ways. The second problem that I want to focus on, put forth for further discussion, that again concerns the notion of the human person, is the problem of technological unemployment, which, as I mentioned, already came up in discussion yesterday. Now, we can have a long argument about whether or not there really is going to be a problem of technological unemployment. Dennis argued in his remarks yesterday that technology has for hundreds of years displaced workers in different sectors of the economy, and that we are today just seeing the latest instantiation of that problem. That may well be. My own view is that the problem is perhaps a bit more serious than Dennis suggested. Yes, we still don't see a surprising increase in levels of unemployment, but I think we already are beginning to see the first signs of the larger problem of technological unemployment in the fact that while people still, for the most part, find employment, at least in the United States, one of the phenomena we're dealing with is that the jobs that people are taking once they lose their jobs in, say, the manufacturing sector are inferior jobs. They're working in restaurants. They're working in the service sector of the economy. They're not making the same kind of wage that they were earning with good union jobs of the kind that were common in our economy 50 years ago. But whether or not the problem is already here, there still is, I think, an interesting theoretical issue that we need to think about in this connection. So assume that we are going to be confronting a problem of massive technological unemployment in the future. One of the ways in which we think about the human person historically is through the kind of labor that one does. Many of us define ourselves in terms of the kind of work that we do. When we meet someone for the first time, where does the conversation go to begin with? We talk about what we do. I am a university professor. Tom, who came to my house to help us with a problem the other day, is a plumber. My friend is an attorney, so on and so forth. We often define ourselves in part or in very important ways through the kind of labor that we do. If we face a technological future in which we no longer are employed in the ways in which we formerly were, or if we find ourselves doing lower skill jobs because the kinds of jobs that required the skill set that we think of as definitive of ourselves are no longer a part of our economy, what will be the psychological impact on us of having to live a life where we are not defined by the kind of work that we do? I think that this is going to be a serious problem in the future. Let me now mention a third problem that I think is extremely important, and that is, as artificial intelligence and other related technologies develop further and further, we confront the phenomenon of more and more human-to-human relationships either disappearing because of technology or becoming technologically mediated relationships. So here we are right now in this space, interacting with one another through Zoom. Had it not been for the pandemic, we would have been together in Rome, interacting face-to-face, person to person. Now, Zoom is a wonderful invention. It has made possible the continuation of so many important parts of our lives that would have been so much more difficult to carry forward under pandemic conditions without this technology. Nonetheless, it has changed the felt quality of these interactions in, I think, profoundly important ways. How so? Well, it's been recognized for a long time that sociality is something essential to human personhood. Darwin, more than 100 years ago, when reflecting upon what was distinctive about the human species, argued that it is sociality that has made possible the development of modern civilization, or rather the kinds of beings that were capable of developing civil society. This is a profoundly important part of what we are and who we are as human beings, that we interact with one another face to face in real time. Of course, we don't understand yet from the point of view of, say, cognitive neuroscience, exactly why and how that is so. But all of us in our everyday lives understand intuitively that human relationships, face-to-face human relationships, are extremely important. But we live in a world now where when I go to the supermarket, I often no longer have what I've bought checked out by a human checker. I go to a bank. I no longer interact with a human teller. I use the ATM. And again, here we are in this Zoom space, interacting in a virtual way and not an authentic and real human way. I don't know what the long-term consequences for humanity are going to be of these kinds of shifts, but I strongly suspect that they're going to be really profound changes in the way in which we are shaped as human beings. And it's, I think, one of the most important issues for us to be addressing in this entire space. Well, that's what I wanted to contribute to the conversation to get us started today. And I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Howard. We fully agree with you that Zoom has been fantastic to meet us in this pandemic time, but a real meeting in Rome will be much more interesting. The presential activity could not be changed by the machines. We fully agree with you. And thank you for presenting us these three interesting problems. We will react later about that. And now I would like to introduce you Professor Thierry Magnin. He is Vice President of Catholic University of Lille, and he's an engineer from the École Catholique des Arts et Métiers de Lyon, a Doctor of State in Physical Sciences and Doctor of Theology, a specialist in material physics. He worked 26 years in national scientific research, teaching at the École des Mines de Saint-Étienne and at the University of Lille 1, where he became a university professor. Thank you very much, Professor Magnin, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for this invitation. My talk will be, in fact, divided in 3 points. As an introduction, I will give some classical ethical issues for the use of artificial intelligence in different sectors. In a second part, I will focus about artificial intelligence in medicine through a research program we have recently conducted on ethical questions related to the effect of gut microbiota on health. I will give that as a very good example, I think. And finally, I will speak about the use of artificial intelligence inside sciences and complex sciences to try to solve complex problems that classical mathematical tools are not able to solve today. And at each step, I will give some recommendations with humility about teaching artificial intelligence in our Catholic University. And I will distinguish artificial intelligence as a tool in computer science and artificial intelligence as a true cognitive science. This is under discussion in many, many different places. So first point, some general ethical issues. I recall just that artificial intelligence can be defined as a set of high-performance digital techniques which allows for the processing of very large amounts of data that a human being alone cannot process. The use of artificial intelligence in medical imaging, for instance, and its analysis is already relevant. For instance, the detection of the early stages of melanoma in order to treat it as quick as possible. There are many such examples in the fields of health, insurance, economics, transport, just to name a few examples which show the great interest of artificial intelligence today. And it is in for tomorrow. Deep learning and big data processing of patient-specific information, such as electronic health records, aggregated clinical trials, biomolecular sequencing data, and so permits the design of clinical decision support systems and opens the road for personalized medicine. Artificial intelligence raises many ethical questions which are well known, like privacy, transparency of algorithms, and for instance, those used in risk forecasting in the insurance sector or in the question of replacing humans with intelligent robots in certain jobs, or in the transformation of certain professions such as doctors within the healthcare system. Moreover, artificial intelligence raises another question, which is ethical and broadly anthropological. Could intelligent machines have consciousness, as some believe, with a view to copy or even more to improve the human brain, which neuroscientists are studying and which artificial intelligence researchers seek to simulate? Will a form of artificial consciousness can appear? Why? What do we know? What do we define as a consciousness of a machine? What possible relationships could it have with human consciousness? So that's main general questions related to the human person, as the previous speaker said. But in this short presentation, I just would like to give an example, ethical issues of artificial intelligence in the field of health, and particularly machine and deep learning processes used for the analysis of human microbiota and connected disease. That's my second point. It is a research program that we have conducted with Mathieu Guillermin, my colleague from the Lyon Catholique University, where I was previously, and which has been partly published in Human Science Studies. In this research program, the aim, so I will be a little bit technical, but just to understand the interest of artificial intelligence, the aim was to quantify the impact of the human gut microbiota on health and disease by using metagenomic technology, quantitative and functional. I am not going to describe metagenomic technology, just to understand the background. We know that microbiota can have effects on cardiometabolic disorders or disease, obesity, diabetes, to heart failures. CMD constitutes an extremely acute medical, social, and economic challenge that will become more and more problematic as population ages, though they are at the center of a complex web of influencing factors, among which we can mention the individual genome, as well as environmental parameters such as pollution, utero environment, and also parameters like lifestyle specificities such as dietary habits, for instance. So the mechanisms are still to be elucidated, and the use of big data processing using machine learning or deep learning process is quite important to solve such questions. So in virtue of the complexity of these phenomena associated with this kind of disease and this kind of situation, the approach can be nothing but big data. So with these techniques, deep learning and big data techniques, we expect to extrapolate insightful correlations, and it's correlations, it's not causes, between the different parameters to be able to say what are the main parameters. The program involves many types of patients, CMD patients at different stages, patients with different predisposing factor and control group, from which various sorts of information are collected. So clinical, anthropometrical, biomedical data, weight, glucose tolerance status, adiposity, and so are integrated with information obtained through questionnaire about medical history and lifestyle of people, not only dietary habits, but also socioeconomic status or educational level and psychological stress or perceived quality of life. So very close to the human person parameters. So it's not difficult to understand that the serious ethical questions are related to privacy protection in this kind of research, but the lifestyle parameters are quite important to understand the behavior of the microbiota and the consequences for disease. So we need these very personal parameters. So privacy protection, massive surveillance, but also algorithm transparency, especially with machine learning, data ownership, digital divides, intellectual property, and access rights. And in our study with Mathieu Guillermin, we highlight another important ethical point related to the mobilization of big data and deep learning in the fields of biomedical research and healthcare. We show how an overestimation of big data epistemic power can become ethically problematic. Some instance, it is this kind of calculations are deemed to be very neutral, which is not the case. We insist upon the ethical importance of a critical epistemological approach in which big data are understood as possibly valuable only when coupled with human intelligence, and particularly for personalized medicine. If you don't critique this overestimation of big data power, that can lead to very problematic reductionism problems. This non-neutrality of artificial intelligence tools is not a problem, in fact, if it clearly appears are reductionisms, which is the case of each science, particularly for medicine uses, but also when you teach to students in our Catholic University. I would say that teaching artificial intelligence needs to propose epistemological trends which are at the basis of the ethical questions then. So that's one of the most important points I was able to show you. Now I would like to focus in a third point and to enlarge this question of the need of epistemology to study ethical issues and to see some consequences in education. First of all, about the non-neutrality of the artificial intelligence uses. Using artificial intelligence to simulate, for instance, the human brain with artificial neurons, as it is the case in the European project on human brain in Switzerland, for instance, the question of neutrality is quite important. because of the translation of brain activities in numerical codes, one could imagine that it corresponds to a kind of naturalization of human mind. Beside the fact that artificial neurons are today very simple in regards to human neurons in brain and body, one must not forget that this naturalization of mind proceeds from a threshold reduction of the mind to cognition, reduction of cognition to calculation, and reduction of calculation to mechanism. But what we can say that to think is to calculate? Yes, the computer Deep Blue defeated in 1997 the world champion Garry Kasparov in chess. Okay, the artificial intelligence system AlphaGo of Google DeepMind beat in 2016 one of the best Go players in the world. Yet one may wonder, even if artificial intelligence won the imitation game Turing test, would this mean that the machine thinks like we do, or that it is endowed with consciousness? Moreover, should we then consider that certain complex form of digitalization could access the mind? We don't think so, but that has to be discussed in a philosophical, epistemological way, and it is quite important to introduce such discussions with our students, for instance, at the master degree level. It is important to sensibilize students in this way. Second point of discussions about rationality and what I will speak about ethics of knowledge. You know that some people consider artificial intelligence as a part of computer science, so with the specific numerical tools, deep learning and so, and correlated ethical questions. I was speaking about some of them, but others consider artificial intelligence as a cognitive science, which involves a kind of ethics of knowledge, I would say. This is quite important in relation also to anthropological questions today. It is well known that humans are not neutral in their judgments. In neurosciences, we speak about cognitive bias. Machine calculations are often considered as neutral by our students, independent of humans' feeling or options, and particularly with deep learning. But it is not the case. Bias still exists in the elaboration of algorithms. And we are, the way we select correlation, for instance, as I said previously, is one of the examples. This reductionism is usual in all science, as I said previously, but it has been, we need to say that. However, we consider artificial intelligence to be able to solve complex scientific questions because of the ability to detect all possible solutions to problems when a too large number of parameters are in complex systems. It is what we can call data-driven science as a radical answer to the limitation of the hypothesis-driven scientific research, which is the classical way in the scientific field, and which is known to be irreducible and with a part of human subjectivity. And if you think about human subjectivity in hypothesis-driven scientific, some people expect that for the data-driven science, you will reach a quite important non-subjectivity. In fact, this is a very promising approach if we don't forget the non-neutrality of artificial intelligence processes. We have to pay attention in our teaching, according to me, about teaching about this data-driven science, not to be fundamentalist, conceiving big data process of knowledge production like the highest form of objectivity and rationality, yes, artificial intelligence way can be a very interesting way, not to understand, but to be able to reach and to propose solutions in complex systems. It is true, and it will be more and more true, but it's not neutral. We have not to be data fundamentalist, I think, and it is for the freedom quite important to speak about that, even if sometimes we heard about kind of sentences like massive data sets and predictive analytics always reflect objective truths. Some people can think that the deep learning can produce absolutely objective knowledge, so it's very important to discuss such positions. In conclusion of this 15 minutes talk, I would say that the epistemological point of view is quite important, to my opinion, for teaching artificial intelligence in our university. It is quite important first when we consider the ethical issues of the use of artificial intelligence as a tool in computer science, but also when artificial intelligence is considered as a cognitive science with an ethics of knowledge, particularly important for interaction with philosophical problem as human person in our Catholic universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Magnin. Thanks to all of both panelists. You have been very on time, very disciplined, and you follow the suggestion of the 15 minutes. Now the floor is open for questions. We will do the questions through the chat. There is another option is questions and answers. You may write your questions, and as you probably will be starting writing your questions, I would like to start with the first one, opening the floor. And this is a question for Professor Howard. In your second problem, you spoke about the technological unemployment. And that remember me the same discussion that was held in the 19th century in relation with mechanicism, related to the Industrial Revolution and all the discussion on machines at the time. Do you think that will be the same? For instance, in Japan, today almost all banks, restaurants, and hotels are automatic, without people, except in the cooks in the restaurant. Do you think that will be the same than before? Thank you.
So this is a complicated question. It is true that when we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and look at the displacement of workers in different sectors of the economy as new technologies emerged, it's true that for more than 150 years, new technologies tended to produce as many jobs or more jobs than were lost in these transformations of our economy. So it's an interesting bit of data that if you look at the US Census from, say, 1880, something like 80%, 85% of people responding to the census reported that they worked in agriculture. They were farmers. By 1900, that percentage had dropped to like 20% of the people reporting in the census. But of course, those people found jobs in manufacturing automobiles and new electronic technologies and so on and so forth. Optimists about the problem of technological unemployment, doing an induction from that historical data, will argue that, well, the same thing's going to happen in the economy of the 21st century as happened in the economy of the 19th and the 20th century. That may well turn out to be the case. On the other hand, as we all know, that's a pretty short timeline on the basis of which to be doing that kind of an induction when the possible consequences for our lives are really significant. And there is evidence out there pointing us in a different direction when it comes to the kinds of transformations that we're experiencing right now. So what's the most important piece of evidence? Well, if you look back historically, you see that up until the late 1980s, going all the way back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was this really interesting correlation between growth in productivity in the economy and income growth. Income and productivity improved in lockstep with one another for over 100 years, well over 100 years. But in the late 1980s, that changed dramatically. So the increase in productivity in the economy has continued on roughly the same scale as we've seen for many, many decades. But in the 1980s, the growth in income plateaued. And if you calculate income in real dollars, it's been pretty much flat since the late 1980s. Well, that's actually an interesting inflection point, because that's the moment in history when the first round of serious technological unemployment, thanks to robotics and AI, first began to impact our economy with first generation industrial robots, which put out of work globally hundreds of thousands of workers who used to build automobiles and washing machines and so on and so forth on our assembly lines. That change in the former linkage between productivity and income might well be the most important piece of evidence, the most important harbinger, suggesting that we really are entering a new era in our economy. Again, we don't see this in the numbers and the unemployment figures. People are still finding jobs, but where we see it is the downskilling of those jobs. The former union member making automobiles in Detroit is now flipping hamburgers at McDonald's and earning only a fraction of what he or she earned before. So I am myself seriously concerned about this trend. Yes, we have to wait and see what the long-term consequences are going to be, but I'm not an optimist. And I think it's going to become a serious problem in the future. And again, it brings us then to core questions about human personhood, because we define ourselves by the work that we do. We train ourselves for the first 2 decades of our lives to be skilled professionals in law or medicine or teaching or the building trades, so on and so forth. That's who we are. And if that's no longer going to be part of the experience of becoming a human person, how is that going to change us?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your answer. There is another question from William Hasselberg.
Paolo, can I just have a reaction?
Please.
Just to say that perhaps for today, it's quite important for doctors, for instance, to be trained at a minimum about artificial intelligence techniques. We will have new job, but in the transition, I would say that it's very important. We have here a faculty of medicine in Lille, for instance, and it's quite important to introduce a minimum of comprehensive techniques about artificial intelligence and other big data processing to be able to have doctors. We have a kind of way to think about what is important when they receive some results coming from these processings, I would say.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you, Thierry. As I said, we have a question from William Hasselberger. It's from Professor Howard. It's not a question, just a suggestion regarding the meaning conferring dimension of employment. So again, the same question of technological unemployment.
Can I ask that question very, very briefly?
Please.
Yeah, so the question is this. I mean, Professor Howard, you said several times that we define ourselves in terms of our paid employment. And I think that's certainly true of modern Americans. I do think there is some cultural variation on this point. I've lived in a number of other countries in the world, and you know, the first thing an American asks when they say, "Who are you?" You say what your paid employment is. You say that in Portugal, at least 20 years ago, maybe when I was here as a kid, it was usually your family, who your parents were, and so forth. And I bring that up because, I mean, the term technological unemployment was first coined by the great, as you know, I'm sure, the great economist Keynes in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren in the 1930s. And he, you know, he said, we will learn to hear of this new term, technological unemployment. And he suggested that there may be a sort of a light at the end of this tunnel, which is that the hard, difficult jobs will be taken up, will be automated. I mean, he doesn't use that term, but he's thinking of machinery. And because of machinery and the growth of productivity, human beings will be able to work much less, which he was wrong about, I think, or his prediction that we would work much less, he was wrong about, but that we could work much less and thereby shift to, as he puts it, the real questions of human experience, which is not how to meet our economic needs by work, but what does life mean? And what do we want to do with ourselves on earth? So I think of the classical Greek notion of schole, the root of our term school, right, which meant leisure. So I'm imagining Keynes thinking of this automated future in which we could pursue humane, liberal leisure activities and learn and develop skills. And I mean, is it necessarily so bad? Are there ways that we could harness this automated future, AI-driven future, for the sake of serious leisure rather than just unemployment and human degradation? Thank you.
So who can forecast the future? One of the conditions of the situation in which we find ourselves now is that it becomes harder and harder as the pace of technological change accelerates to make reliable forecasts about what the felt quality of human life is going to be in the future. So who knows in the end? And I've certainly entertained the possibility that you mentioned here, that this could be a life-enhancing transformation. It could free us from having to do what are sometimes described as the dull, dangerous, and dirty jobs. We can hand those over to the robots, free us to do things that speak to the creative sides of our personality. That might well be. But the problem is that as a society, I don't know how, and I don't think we as a society know how to restructure our world so as to facilitate and promote that kind of transformation. How do we train people in the future if instead of training them for jobs, we train them for creativity? Are our schools ready to meet that kind of a challenge? I don't think so. I don't think we've begun to think about what would be required for that. At the moment, what are people saying about how we manage the transition to the future, and what are the implications for our schools? Well, too many people are saying, well, you've got to teach everybody to know how to code. Well, that's absurd, right? Because nowadays the coding is also done by the machines, right? We're bereft of really creative ideas about how we transform education to help the next generation adapt to what is going to be a very, very different world. I would be a very happy person if my son and my grandchildren were born into a world where they could just follow their hearts and not have their lives be driven by economic necessity. I would be delighted were that our future. I don't know that we yet understand how to manage a transition to that future. But I would come back to your first point about whether or not and in what way and to what extent we define ourselves by what we do. Yes, there's a lot of cultural variability there. It's typical of people in Europe and North America that we introduce ourselves by talking about what we, the kind of work that we do. That's not typical of all cultures. But the fact that that's the way in which we represent ourselves to one another doesn't necessarily speak to the way we understand ourselves as productive human beings. I think there are important issues of social psychology that have to be investigated in this space. Instead of just having philosophers like myself speculate in an empirically uninformed armchair way about the relevant aspects of human nature. But again, it's a hugely important challenge and one that I think we aren't yet recognizing in its full extent.
This is a fascinating question, absolutely. Any other comments, any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Please, Isabel.
Well, shifting a little bit from the discussion about the vita activa and how it is our actions that define who we are, but moving into more the physiological dimension, touching upon issues that Thierry was also addressing. A couple of years ago, we had at the university a landmark conference that rocked the waves. It was given by a robotics expert in Japan, Hiroshi Ishiguro, who claimed at one stage that, I mean, we are already experimenting physiologically with machine capabilities to expand our possibilities as humans, to extend our lives. And he ended with the utterance, let's face it, our children will be robots. And so how do you see, not really talking about the issues of what we do, but what we are as physiological, as biological matter, and how technology is changing that as well. Of course, we know the technology has extended the capabilities of humans from primitive times. I mean, that's the way things have evolved over time. But we are really in a watershed moment. I would like to hear from your perspectives, which are complementary, a philosophical and a physicist, how you see this transformation.
Can I give some words about that? Huh?
Please, please.
Pablo? Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was a question, an open question for you. Please.
I suggest some hypotheses to discuss. I think that I do agree with the fact that this kind of technologies and artificial intelligence, numerical and different numerical aspects are very, very important to change our future, and particularly the relations we have with other people and the way to live in the world. Okay. But I think that I very often seen that technology are thought as means to solve complexity and to be able to find one solution to each problem. I would say in front of the complexity of life, in front of the complexity of sciences like biology or neurosciences, technologies and numerical technologies can appear as a very good way to have one solution to one problem, to cut the form of uncertainty, I would say, that we are now we make the experiment of this uncertainty in the life, and to be in the uncertainty in the life is very unstable. And very often numerical tools are seen to be a solution to this uncertainty, to go back to certainty. I think there is a kind of reductionism here, which is not only applied to techniques, but which is also questions of mentality, because very often we are lost in front of uncertainty. What I do understand, it's not so easy to work with uncertainty, but I wouldn't like that technology appears are good solutions, which will be solutions coming from outside of our humanity, which will be a kind of miracles coming from other place than our own reflections. Do you see what I mean? I think that there is really a question of mentality in front of this technology, to be able to integrate this technology as important tools which change our relation to reality, but which are not a kind of miraculous way to cut uncertainty.
May I also respond to Isabel's question? I'm sorry I didn't have the opportunity to be at that conference. It sounds like it was a very provocative claim that Shiguro made. But I also don't know exactly what he meant by that. But what it brings to my mind is another issue that we haven't so far addressed in this discussion yesterday and today, and that is the merger of these new technologies with the human body itself. One possible future that we might have to contemplate and deal with is one in which we begin to integrate the artificial into the natural. So Elon Musk has launched this company that has been developing what he at one time called neural lace, which is nanoscale fibers that would be implanted in the human brain and would be able to communicate with individual neurons in the human brain. He's said a few months ago that he's already done this with a pig. So, I mean, we've actually tested this technology, and in some sense, it works. We already have the capability to grow artificial organs and to integrate into artificial organs a biocompatible nanoscale wiring. We are on the threshold of a technological revolution where we can begin to integrate microelectronics in the human body and turn us into androids of a kind that we never imagined. Will this happen? I don't know. Elon Musk is trying to drive this transformation. I think the nanoscale did something strange there. I'm not sure where that's but my point is this, that there's a sense in which here's another challenge to our conception of human personhood. If we begin to integrate these technologies literally within the human body, and I don't know how we deal with that kind of a future world.
I have an open question for both panelists. You spoke about that we are not robots. And I would like to say that during the confinement, during this pandemic, we accelerate the use of technology. Zoom, internet in general, all kind of machines. But that also generates much more anxiety, much more psychological problems. And there is a very interesting phenomena worldwide, is that people start a movement to return to nature. Much more people trying to do a walk on the mountains, doing hiking, going the weekend to national parks or just to parks near home, just to go out and disconnect of all this technology. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd be happy to begin. I think it's important to remember that we are, among other things, the product of biological evolution. And when we think about what makes us what we are, what makes us happy and whole as human beings, we have to remember that we evolved in an environment very, very different from the environment that we inhabit today. And it could well be that this, if you will, back to nature phenomenon is a way that we as biological organisms respond to the stresses of a world of a kind that we, our ancestors didn't evolve in. So that could be part of what's going on here, is just this felt sense that we need to reclaim that which is part of our biological humanity.
Yeah. Professor Magnin,
Yeah.
any comments?
We have seen during the confinement that this way of relation through numerical tools is quite important. We are still in connection, and we want to increase this possibility without making a long displacement, for instance, to meet colleagues or other people. That's sure. And during the confinement, we have still connections, so we were not alone, completely alone. So first of all, I would say it was a very interesting tool. Now, when you look to, when you heard to some psychologists, and particularly during the period of deconfinement, we heard about difficulties now of relations between people, even if these numerical tools were very useful during the confinement. And I think that when you experiment that the physical senses are quite important, but now if you touch somebody, you can give him the coronavirus. If you speak to somebody, you can give him the coronavirus. There is a question of the use of senses. And I would say that the two things, the lack of direct proximity and the difficulty to touch and to use our physical senses without giving to the others the coronavirus, is a kind of mixture which produces anxiety, I would say, and a feeling of loneliness. And I think that the desire to go in proximity of nature is something which is a kind of compensation of these psychological effects, which are very complex. I just suggest some way to think about that.
Yeah, we have another question from Corinne Mellul. Corinne?
Hi, can you hear me? I'm trying to start the video.
We hear you.
Yes, hi, everybody.
Hello,
I want to say thank you to the two of you for terrific, stimulating talk. I wanted to, it's not really a question, it's rather perhaps a comment, but that will elicit more comments on your part, hopefully. I wanted to go back to Don, mainly what you said about what this will do to labor, basically, job displacements and so on. And I wanted to take as a point of a reference, rather than the previous industrial revolution, 19th century, what happened with the beginning of globalization in the US and in Europe, and deindustrialization. And what I wanted to draw attention to was, and that's rather my field, I'm a political scientist, the political implications, perhaps in the long run, within a decade or two. What happened with the previous wave of job displacement, if you want to call it that, is simply that governments failed to foresee the need to retrain people on a grand scale. I'm talking about deindustrialization, about industrial jobs being exported basically to Asia. Most governments in Europe and in the US failed to foresee the need to retrain people in a way that would make them more, in terms of skills, adapted to the new jobs, to basically service jobs, which is what the economies were evolving towards. I just wanted to share a concern that this might be the case again today, and for simple reasons. If we look at the West and at democracies in general, the political cycle, the election cycle in democracies is very short. It's 4 years, 5 years. Usually you have 2 terms, a limit of 2 terms. That's the norm. And so you need quick results, that you can't really have long-term thinking. I'm not saying that it never happens. I'm not saying that there are not multiple other factors accounting for people not having been retrained, etc., or these public policies not having been put in place. But I think this is an important factor. And so I share your concern, Don, also because of this reason. I thought this is a dimension I would also talk about because it wasn't mentioned a lot. I would describe it as a perhaps compounding factor in this whole picture.
Well, thank you for that. I agree with you that governments in Europe and the US, North America, did a very poor job of helping our labor force through that transition that started in the 1980s. And I think we're once again seeing the same kind of blindness or myopia on the part of those in power. Dennis yesterday commented rightly that one of the things that's characteristic about this new wave of technological unemployment is that it affects not just the, as we say, blue collar workers, the people in working in industry. It affects the white collar workers, or to put it in a slightly different vocabulary, this next wave of technological unemployment is going to be impacting not just manual labor, but intellectual labor. I give a couple of examples to my students when we talk about this. One is that when I was a young person, if you went into the offices of any major architectural or engineering firm, and you just looked at the physical space that they inhabited, central to such firms was a giant room filled with drafting tables, with brand new graduates of engineering programs or architecture programs sitting at those drafting tables, taking the brilliant ideas of the engineers and the architects and reducing them to blueprints. And that was the typical entry job for young engineers and young architects. You now go visit any engineering firm or architectural firm, and that space is there, but it's empty, because we no longer need that kind of intellectual labor. We have this revolution of computer-aided design. The computers generate the blueprints. Or another silly example that I give, but I think it's a telling example because it touches upon not just intellectual, but artistic labor. I asked my students to go back, go on Netflix or wherever it's available, and look at a late 1990s episode of the TV show The Simpsons, and scroll to the very end of the show. Look at the credits at the end, and you will come to a point in the credits where you will see this long list of Korean names. Why Korean names? It's because in the 90s, the producers of that show were outsourcing the drawing of the cartoons to studios in Korea. Now, look at an episode today, scroll to the end, look at the credits. Those credits aren't there anymore because, again, now the computers do all of that illustration work. So the threat is profoundly different from what it was 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And again, I think that people in positions of responsibility are largely clueless about these transformations and about how to help us to manage these transformations.
Fully agree.
Thank you. We have another question from João Pedro Monteiro.
Hello, everybody. I have a philosophical question for Don. The question is, do you think we will be able at some stage to upload our mind? Can we transfer an emotional state? Can we clone our brain information? And further, can we clone our mind, this beautiful dance between intelligence and consciousness? And can we use that to send it to exoplanet in many years from now and clone a robot with humanity? I would like to hear. It's a bit unfair, this question, but since you are a visionaire, I was interested if you made a comment on this.
So thank you for the question. Again, one can't forecast the future, but let's talk about what's already within our technical capabilities. So it was a good 10 years ago that the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, part of the Department of Defense here in the US, launched a project that was called Project Remind. The stated public purpose of this project was the following. We see a lot of traumatic brain injuries among combatants these days because we got good body armor. So, people don't die, they might lose a limb, but we're seeing an increase in traumatic brain injuries among combatants. And one form that this sometimes takes is that someone who suffers such a traumatic brain injury might no longer be capable of recognizing a loved one, a partner, a child, so forth. So the question was, can we do something technologically to retrieve those memories before sending someone into combat and then restore those memories were there a traumatic brain injury? So this sounds like utter science fiction. But here's what happened. So one team experimenting with rats did the following. They put this electrode or set of contacts on into the brain of the rats. They trained the rats to run a maze. And then they literally downloaded onto a chip the memory of the rat. And then, I don't know exactly what this means, by chemical means, they destroyed the memory of the rat's memory about how to run the maze. So it couldn't run the maze anymore. And then they uploaded the memory from the chip and the rat could run the maze again. Not quite as well as before, but way beyond 50%. Right. Then they did the following. They took two genetically identical rats, one in the US, one in Brazil. They had the one in the they had them set up with identical mazes. They trained the one in the US. They downloaded the memory of the rat trained in the US onto a chip. They sent that via the internet to Brazil and uploaded it into the brain of the Brazilian rat. And suddenly the Brazilian rat could run the maze when it hadn't been trained on the maze. We don't know exactly how this worked, but we did this. We literally downloaded a memory and uploaded it again. So this is not the future. This is the present. Who knows where this is going to go?
So Elon Musk is right then. With this Neuralink approach, you'll be able to find out the microcircuits in our neocortex and upload the memories and information.
Well, I never thought I would see this happen, but it's happened. Yeah.
We cannot stop science and human evolution and progress.
Even though sometimes we might want to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Floor is still open. We have 8 more minutes.
Just Pablo, if
please,
related to the last questions and the answer, we have a lot of job for education in front of such questions and particularly for the sense of the human persons. And I think our job as educators and professors and teachers in Catholic University is particularly important in front of these possibilities, which has been described in the last example, for instance, and which will increase a lot in future. So we can do the best or the worst, that's sure. And about freedom, what does that mean? So really, we have to introduce our sense of the human person in the way to propose courses on sciences, technologies, and economy.
Absolutely. This is a great challenge for our universities. We have another comment from Johan de Tavernier. Johan, please. The floor is yours.
To unmute myself. Okay.
Okay.
Could you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question with regard to what Don Howard has said. He has given a couple of examples in the of human nature. And my question is, from a Christian viewpoint, I am in personalist morals. Does it still a discussion, let us say, how to think about it? Could we allow, could we go for it, could we accept it? And if yes, how to think about this from, let us say, the background of responsibility? Could we use newer technologies in a responsible way? Or do we have to say, no, this is not allowed?
Well, if I might.
Yes, please.
I'm not sure who is going to say, who is in a position of authority to say this is not allowed. The way the world works is that people are going to try to do things regardless of what smart and reflective and morally sophisticated individuals might say about the wisdom of pursuing this course or another. Whether I think we should go down one of these paths rather than another, it all depends upon the details. Some of the technologies that I've just mentioned could actually be, in some respects, life enhancing. But again, it all depends on the details. What is the responsible thing to do? It's not up to me to decide that. It's up for us as a humankind to have the public debate about.
Yeah, that's true, Don. But sometimes, let us say, I'm teaching here at civil engineering faculties, and we are also involved. It's a Catholic university. We are involved in these kind of discussions. Often, let us say, we receive even project proposals from DARPA, as you mentioned. And the question with regard to the example you have given, do we allow our researchers to participate, seeing the fact that they are all collaborators of this Catholic university? Do we reject the technology as such, or do we accept it and, let us say, make proportional reasoning approach in order to say in this context, yes, if this is the aim, okay. If this is the aim, no, we disagree. It's a rather fundamental question, I think.
So if I might, I think it's especially important for Catholic universities to be part of this conversation. The church has played a leadership role for a long time in helping us negotiate the way in which technology has transformed our lives. For the Catholic universities to be a credible voice in these conversations, I think it's absolutely essential that we do engage in the research in these areas. We might decide not to do some particular kind of research, but to have the competence to do this kind of research is important for the purpose of making the voices of Catholic universities credible voices in the public debate. I think that's extremely important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a last question, just to be on time, a short question again from Corinne Melul. Corinne, please.
Yes. Okay, camera. I want to raise, I know it's a big question and there's only a few minutes left, but I want to raise a question that I look at in my work at IFCU, which is the question of epistemology. That's to the both of you, or Don, whatever time is left. Question of epistemology and the status of knowledge. What this is doing to the learning process, especially of students, but in general, as we see, for example, the way that social media today competes with science and what we used to call reliable sources in terms of deriving reliable knowledge. And I happen to be very concerned and skeptical about artificial intelligence and technology replacing. I think that the overall aim, as it seems to be developing, is to make the learning process easier, personalized, et cetera, et cetera. The notion of effort, notion of difficulty, I think, is central to the development of technologies right now toward less effort, less difficulty, more customization, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to raise the question of whether in the long term or medium term even, we're not going to witness a total collapse of what, the methodologies derived from the Enlightenment thinking and the superiority of science and the pursuit of objective knowledge, etc.
You raise a very big question. I don't know exactly what to say about it, other than to note that the brain is a muscle, and like all muscles, it must be exercised in order to for it to remain healthy and capable of doing all that it can. So were it to be the case that these technologies made learning easier, that could be in some ways helpful. I mean, it's wonderful to have, as my son once said, the entirety of the world's knowledge in the smartphone in my hand. I can access information far more easily than I could decades ago. But if this had the consequence that we were no longer challenged to develop our thinking abilities, it would be a disaster. I'm not sure that's where we're headed, though. I really don't know. I look at my students, I compare them to my students of 30 years ago, and quite frankly, the sense I have is that at least in my classrooms, I see students who are just as eager to do the hard work, if not more eager to do the hard work, than was the case with the sort of disaffected generation of the 80s, for example. So I think I'm on the whole a little bit more optimistic than you are about where this might go. But again, who knows?
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time for closing this session, just to allow for next sessions to start also on time. So I would like to thank Professor Howard and Professor Magnin for their extremely and fascinating comments, for the provocative conversation. Thanks to all people attending this session and for all their questions. And just to do a very, very short resume and following Howard and Magnin words, it is very important to involve Catholic universities in the research and teaching on